and it'll still be open at 5. So, but for now, it's over to Ian Huyett. I haven't got my paper with me, so I'll let you introduce the subject yourself. Ian.
Thank you. I'm presenting on religious parallels to the simulation hypothesis, and I've been hardwired to speak standing on my feet for 3 years, so sitting down will actually be an adventure. Elon Musk, I don't think it'll be controversial to say, is one of the most influential people alive today. You have seen his face on the screen several times the last couple days, but he hasn't just been influential in the areas of business and technology, he's also been very philosophically influential. And Musk has probably done more than anyone else to promote something called the simulation argument, which is an idea coined by the philosopher Nick Bostrom, who you've also heard a lot about, in about 2003. Bostrom has a high profile in his own right. Bill Gates has encouraged people to read his books for the last couple of years. And the simulation argument has attracted a lot of serious attention from people like the philosopher David Chalmers. But 2 years ago, when Musk talked about the argument at this conference, he really catapulted it to new levels of media attention. And my goal here is not assessing the merits of the argument, but just to give you some context, I'll tell you briefly what Musk said. He pointed out that in his lifetime, we've gone from having Pong to having pretty compelling looking simulations. Musk said you should assume some rate of improvement, and so eventually we'll have simulations that are indistinguishable from reality. And from that, Musk concludes that the odds are billions to 1, he says, that we currently live in a computer program. And people were laughing as Musk started to introduce this argument, and understandably so, because it absolutely sounds like the conclusion of a reductio ad absurdum argument. But a lot of people were listening, and I'll give you just one example of that. Just a few months after Musk made these comments, Bank of America released a report to clients that discussed developing virtual reality technology. And in this report, Bank of America analysts actually said, unironically, there's a 20 to 50% chance that we live in a simulated virtual world. Where did they get those very specific numbers? Some people have some questions about that, but the fact is that it's an influential theory, it's influenced influential people, and so it's worth discussing for that reason. And I'm interested in how this argument speaks to religion and naturalism, especially because Musk, probably like most advocates of this simulation argument, could in any other context be described as a naturalist with no hesitation. But here he is saying that the universe was created, that it was created at least partly with us in mind, that it was designed by agents who transcended for some conscious purpose. So these don't sound like the sorts of things naturalists typically say, and that raises the question, is a naturalism that has room for these ideas really a naturalism worth its salt? Does the simulation argument move the boundary line between religion and naturalism? And do religious traditions speak uniquely to the questions that are raised by the simulation argument? So Bostrom actually, in his original paper in 2003, pointed out that there are religious implications to the argument. And he was referring here to omnipotence, omniscience, the argument raising the probability of an afterlife, Bostrom thought. But Bostrom also pointed out in this paper that if the argument goes through for us and shows that we live in a computer-generated world, it would also go through for the people Musk thinks created us, and so on. So I'm going to focus on 3 religious traditions that parallel the argument, not just in the most obvious ways, but also in that they involve a belief in descending levels of reality and some engagement with the idea that our universe is derivative of some higher reality. So the first tradition I'm going to talk about is Gnosticism. Gnosticism was a heterodox community that operated on the periphery of the early Christian church for the first few centuries of its existence. It competed with the group that became Orthodox in Christian history for the mantle of Christian orthodoxy. And Gnostics rejected traditional monotheism. They believed in one holy, very remote, very indescribable God, and below that God, a hierarchy of lesser gods who produced each other one level after another. And ultimately, Gnostics thought our universe was created sort of illicitly by this evil God. And that evil God, Gnostics believed, patterned our universe on this order of the heavens with himself at the top. So Gnostics were very concerned with this idea of our universe being derivative, being a copy off of the true, the real, the original universe. And because our universe was derivative to Gnostics, because it was a copy, they felt it was unreal, it was a farce, it was a universe not really worth living in. And they didn't want anything to do with this universe or with the matter in it. So you may think that debates between Gnostics and Christians in the 2nd century, or Gnostics and, say, Plotinus, who I'll talk a bit about in the 3rd century, are these just obscure old theological debates about the problem of evil. But many of us probably have Gnostic-like instincts about the simulation argument. We feel intuitively that if we were to live in a simulated universe, that would be a devalued universe. It would be a universe less worth living in if it were made of computer bits rather than physical particles. So when David Chalmers, a philosopher who is engaged with the simulation argument, talks about whether a universe made of computer bits would be real in the fullest sense, he's having a debate that was had millennia ago between the Gnostics and their opponents. And that brings me to the second tradition I'd like to discuss, Neoplatonism. You heard from Scott recently about Eric Steinhardt, and Eric Steinhardt, I would say, is probably the most interesting philosopher engaged with the simulation argument and its religious implications, an American philosopher of religion. And he's commented on these parallels between Neoplatonism and the simulation argument. Neoplatonism does involve, like Gnosticism, these descending levels of reality, each one creating the next. But Neoplatonists usually did not think that our universe was patterned on some higher reality. So the hierarchy for Plotinus, who was the sort of father of Neoplatonism, was the one, intellect, the soul, and nature. And in Ibn Gabirol, who was a Jewish Neoplatonist, it was God, will, matter, and form. But Neoplatonism was very engaged with this Gnostic idea that a derivative universe would be a less valuable universe. And so Plotinus responded to Gnostics by saying that if our universe were derivative, it would be as complete and full of detail as it would otherwise be. And for example, he said to Gnostics, if there is another sun in the divine sphere that is the archetype of our sun, if it is more splendid than the sun visible to us, Plotinus wrote, what a sun it must be. So his argument was the universe's being derivative wouldn't make it less complete or less beautiful. And David Chalmers, again, makes a very similar argument about the simulation concept. Chalmers argues that if the universe were a simulation, it would be just as real as it would otherwise be. All the same information would still be there, but it would be made of computer bits instead of particles. And so we can say that Chalmers was really fully preempted by Plotinus in the 3rd century. Chalmers also, in 2016, said this about the simulation argument. I think many people should concede this is one route to at least the possibility of a creator, which suddenly seems somewhat more naturalistic and somewhat less spooky and metaphysical than many of the traditional views. And here I think many people who otherwise consider themselves atheists are actually taking this possibility seriously. Here, though, I think Plotinus and Chalmers end up parting ways because Plotinus said, even if the universe were derivative, we should look at the universe and be seized with reverence. Whereas Chalmers will say things like, well, we can say the simulation argument would involve gods of some kind. They wouldn't be gods worthy of reverence, according to Chalmers. And so that brings me to the third and last tradition I'd like to discuss, Mormonism or Latter-day Saints, because they were very much engaged with this exact issue. Mormonism is, of course, a historically American phenomenon founded in the United States during the Jackson era. There are not very many here in the UK. You all have about 200,000 relative to 6 million in the United States, although thanks to the Panaceans, there is a claimant to the Garden of Eden in the UK, much like in the United States. But Mormonism is really a global phenomenon now because there are now more Mormons outside the United States than in the country where it was originally founded. So it's not a central issue in Mormonism, but Mormonism, especially historically, does agree with Gnostics and with Neoplatonists on this idea that there are a descending series of levels of reality, that our universe is patterned on some higher reality. A Mormon scholar, Richard Lyman Bushman, has said that according to the cosmogony of Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, there is an alliance of divine beings stretching back in time, and that process never began and will never end. So in other words, On Mormonism, the God of our universe was once a finite entity under the power of a preceding God who was once a finite man, and so on forever. And while most Mormons do not think about this teaching very often, those who do look forward to their own eventual deification, to creating people who will themselves one day become gods, and so on, and believe that process will continue forever. Really, though, contrary to some Christian criticisms of Mormonism, it's not helpful to understand Mormonism as polytheistic, and I may have just given the impression that it is, because Mormonism really takes the opposite tack relative to Gnosticism and acknowledges the immediate creator of our universe as God in the fullest sense. So one historic Mormon publication said, "He is our Father and our God, and the only God with whom we have to do." In other words, the immediate God is God for all intents and purposes, the opposite reaction to that Gnostics had to this idea of a sort of descending series. So circling back for a moment to Chalmers, I think we should be unsurprised that some people would say on the simulation argument, those deities wouldn't be worthy of reverence, because the traditional line of the new atheists in the vein of Hitchens and Dawkins has been to say that if the traditional God exists, he is unworthy of reverence. So of course, any lesser entity is also going to be unworthy of reverence to people who adopt that mindset. But I think it is significant that millions of Mormons are completely untroubled by this idea that the God of our universe was once a finite being, that he created the universe out of pre-existing matter, and so on. And we might even say that Mormons could feel vindicated when people like Musk talk about the simulation argument, and it sounds a whole lot like the cosmogony of Mormonism. I should clarify, though, I think that Mormons would not say the simulation argument by itself gives you a God worthy of reverence, but I do think it's significant that not only does the simulation argument sound much more like Mormonism, for example, than anything naturalists have historically said, but Mormonism would say a God who is finite or was finite, created the universe out of pre-existing material, that God would not be unworthy of worship on that account. So I think it's really here that we can see how far naturalists who embrace the simulation argument have strayed from the traditional comfort zone of naturalism. Because suppose a Mormon, for example, were to say to Musk or Chalmers or Neil deGrasse Tyson, you now believe in Mormon metaphysics. In other words, you might not be on board with the normative implications, with the worship, but you are saying that some religious traditions were correct in broad outline about the descriptive way things are. Probably the easiest response for a naturalist at that point would just be to refer to the specific revelation or miracle claims of whatever religious person they were talking to and deny that revelation or those miracle claims. But even that distinction isn't really as significant as it might seem, because Musk, who thinks the odds are billions to one we live in a simulation, believes in exactly the kinds of things that could cause miracles or cause some special revelation. So previously, a naturalist who doesn't accept the simulation hypothesis might say something like, for any given phenomenon, an explanation which excludes God is always to be preferred to an explanation which involves God. But a naturalist who subscribes to the simulation argument cannot do that because that atheist, for all intents and purposes and in effect, believes in a God, believes in something that could cause miracles. And so the result of this is that you will have theistic claims, or claims that at least sound traditionally theistic, that need to be evaluated by atheists in the way that naturalistic claims would be evaluated. So how has the boundary line between religion and naturalism been moved? Has it been expanded so as to accommodate the transcendent? I don't think so. That would mean that naturalism is such a big tent that it is inclusive of Mormonism. On the other hand, all the cosmogonies I just talked about have traditionally been seen as religious and as anathema to naturalism. So I think if Elon Musk's argument leaves any tenable boundary between naturalism and religion, it's because it has moved into territory already occupied by religion, and it's raised issues that religious traditions have already engaged with. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Robert.
Thank you. I love Gnosticism, so it was fun hearing you make those connections. I have one little historical correction to make and then a question.
Please.
Nick Bostrom did not invent the simulation hypothesis. Hans Moravec did in the early 90s in an essay called Pigs in Cyberspace. It's his concluding remark is essentially the simulation hypothesis, which he then reiterates in the book Robot in 1999. I can't remember if Moravec talked about it in Mind Children in 1988. My question is about the Bank of America reference. What possible relevance could that have, the simulation hypothesis, have for them? What was their motivation in even engaging it?
Well, first of all, I'm happy to cede credit to Moravec. I guess we should say that Bostrom did something like what Musk did for the simulation argument, but maybe in the realm of academics. He sort of propelled it.
Much bigger, more robust.
Right, and Bostrom's argument is, I should clarify, is fairly well developed and is more sophisticated than the very brief summary I just gave. But yeah, with respect to virtual reality, that is what this section of this report was talking about, developments in virtual reality technology. And these Bank of America analysts wanted to just inform people about all of the current academic thinking on virtual reality. And I suppose you could say they were thinking that people would be more interested in developing virtual reality technology if they thought we were living in a virtual reality.
Okay, anyone else? No? Everybody's tired.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.